Today, we're venturing deep into the woods of Indiana to uncover a story of hope, hardship, in a community that was almost completely erased from history. It's a story hidden right under our feet about a place called Lick Creek. So here's the big question, right? How does a whole community, we're talking hundreds of people, successful farms, a real thriving settlement, just vanish? In the mid-1800s, Lick Creek was going strong, and then it felt like almost overnight, poof, it was gone. You know, if you were to walk the Lick Creek Trail today, you could easily miss it. You'd be standing right on top of what used to be homes and farms and a church. All that's really left are these faint echoes in the forest, a small cemetery, and clues buried just beneath the dirt. So how did this all even begin? To really get Lick Creek, we have to jump back to the early 1800s. This was a time when freedom wasn't something you were just given. It was a journey you had to take. It was really a classic push-pull situation. If you were a free black family living in North Carolina back then, life was getting harder and harder. New laws were incredibly restrictive, basically pushing you out. But at the same time, you had this powerful pull from the north, Indiana. It was a new free state, and crucially, it had these Quaker communities who were staunchly anti-slavery. That promise of owning your own land with supportive neighbors, that made the incredibly difficult journey worth the risk. And boy, did they succeed. The first families showed up in 1811. By 1832, you have men like Benjamin Roberts and Peter Lindley officially buying land directly from the U.S. government. I mean, think about that. From there, the community just exploded, hitting its peak in both size and population right on the eve of the Civil War. And just look at this map. It really shows you how successful they were. Every one of those colored blocks is land owned by a black family. We're talking over 1,500 acres. This wasn't just a couple of cabins in the woods. This was a huge, essential, and really surprisingly integrated community of farmers and families. So what was it actually like for the people who carved a home for themselves out of this dense forest? Well, the absolute heart of Lick Creek, no question, was the AME Church. It was founded on land sold by two of the pioneers, Thomas and Matilda Roberts, and it was so much more than a place of worship. It was the school, it was the community center, it was the glue that held the entire settlement together. Now, don't get me wrong, life was hard work. I mean, really tough. These settlers faced the same brutal challenges as any pioneer. They were clearing thick forests by hand, raising animals, building absolutely everything from the ground up. But the thing that made Lick Creek so special was that it was an integrated community. You had black and white farmers living and working side by side as neighbors. But even in a so-called free state, freedom was fragile. And soon, the whole political mood started to shift, putting everything these settlers had built in serious jeopardy. Okay, let's talk about the single most important thing you could possess here, a set of freedom papers. These were not just documents, they were a lifeline. See, Lick Creek was only about 30 miles from Kentucky, a slave state. That meant the threat of being kidnapped by slave catchers was a constant, terrifying reality. Without these papers to prove you were free, you could be snatched, sold down the river, and never heard from again. They were your only real defense. And then, the state of Indiana itself turned on them. First, the 1851 Constitution completely banned any new black settlers from even coming into the state. Then, just 2 years later, the Negro Register made things even worse. Every black person already living there now had to go register with the county, give a detailed physical description, and, this is the most humiliating part, they had to find a white person to vouch for their character. This quote from the historical record, man, it really says everything. This wasn't just some bureaucratic hassle. It was a direct attack on their dignity, on their very freedom. The legal foundation of their community was being deliberately torn apart. And that brings us to the year that everything changed. Despite all these hostile laws, the community had managed to hang on. But 1862 was the breaking point. And the collapse happened with just shocking speed. Get this, in a single month, September of 1862, 7 families sold off over 500 acres of land. That's nearly a third of the entire settlement. Gone. Just like that. These were families who had spent decades building their lives there, and they were suddenly leaving all at once. So why the sudden mass exodus? Well, it wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm. The Civil War was raging, and even though Indiana was a Union state, you had a lot of Copperheads. These were Northerners who sympathized with the South. This created an incredibly hostile, even dangerous atmosphere. At the same time, new factory jobs were opening up in big cities like Chicago. So you had this increasing hostility at home and new economic opportunity elsewhere. The hard decision to leave started to feel like the only one that made sense. So the community vanished. But the story wasn't over. It was just buried, waiting for someone to find it. The decline was fast. By 1870, there were only 75 black residents left. A man named William Thomas, whose father was one of the first settlers, was the last to hold out. He finally sold his land in 1902. A few decades after that, the government bought up all the old farmland, and the forest just grew back over everything. For nearly a century, the story just lay dormant, but then archaeologists started digging, and what they found were the little everyday details of life. Nails from a cabin, a piece of a broken plate, a kid's marble, even little stubs of slate pencils, which tells us that the residents could read and write. Every single artifact is like another word in a story that we're still piecing together. And here's the most powerful part of this whole thing. The story is still being written. Just this year, direct descendants of those original pioneers came back to Lick Creek. They worked side by side with volunteers to clean and restore the headstones in that little cemetery, physically reconnecting with the legacy their ancestors built. And that leaves us with a really important question to think about. The story of Lick Creek was almost lost forever. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How many other stories like this one, these incredible stories of resilience and community, are still out there, just waiting for us to find their echoes in the forest?